moment. How does your childhood and the whole, being invaded by the Nazis, something most of us have only seen in the movies, you experienced as a child. And then shortly after, you lost loved ones, and then shortly after that, your parents split. You remember, I think you remember...
No, they split before the war, because I was 10 when the war broke out. In fact, I was in England when the war broke out. I was alone in England. My mother brought me back to Holland where they were living. And this was in September, and in May, the Germans marched into Holland. They had first marched into Poland, and Holland was next. And you say, what was it like?
Well, it must have left you very insecure. I don't know if it did. I would guess that it would. I mean,
that is not what left me insecure. My father leaving us left me insecure, for life, perhaps. I do think there are things that, that experiences in childhood form you for the rest of your life. That's also why I'm so concerned with children today, not just that they're starving and so forth, but children that are surrounded by violence and horror, what this is going to do to them. And UNICEF can do very little about that. But to come back to childhood, if I think there's so many images that will never go away. Such as we were on the radio, we were told to stay indoors, the country had been invaded, to not even appear at the windows, to close the curtains and so forth. Telling me that, of course, I was behind the curtains and I saw these German tanks come in for hours, marching, driving. And Holland fell after 5 days because it's a small country with a small army, and they fought very bravely, but there was no way of holding back the German army, and all of that is history now. Then followed 5 years, and of course you say, oh my God, isn't that terrible, 5 years of German occupation, which it was. But a child is a child is a child. You live by the day. Obviously it was much worse for my mother in a certain sense than for my family. And just went to school, except that I was shoved into a Dutch school right away, not knowing a word of Dutch, because my mother was worried about this child speaking English in the streets and Germans all around, and she thought that was rather dangerous. So that was a traumatic experience, to end up in a huge classroom not knowing what word that was being said, and every time I opened my mouth, everybody roaring with laughter. That's just great at that age. But it's a great way to learn a language, I can speak Dutch. Then, little by little, yes, there was a knock on the door, and they took my uncle away, who 6 months later was shot, and another uncle too. And my brothers went underground. My uncles were the first hostages to be shot in Holland, and it was actually the turning point, because from that day on, an underground was formed. Because for the first few months, we didn't know quite what had happened. We thought perhaps we were just going to be nicely occupied, and our freedom would be the same. And that's when really the hard times started, because that's when so many reprisals were made, and so many people were shot, and so many people were rounded up and imprisoned. And after the first few months, all Jews had to wear yellow stars, and they started being rounded up and taken away in trucks. And I'd go to the station with my mother to take a train to the next city, and I'd see cattle trucks filled with Jews, picking up more, was standing around us. And I remember so well a little boy, little blonde boy. My mother had to explain all this to me. We did then not yet know that they were going to their death. We'd been told they were going to be taken to special camps. And why, it was very hard for me to understand, because I was 11 or something, But those images have never left me. But neither have the good ones. I had a marvelous family with a great sense of humor.
You were absent a father. There was no man in your life during this
time? Yes, I had my grandfather, and we lived with him, and he did become the father figure in my life. I adored him. And even towards the end of the war, when we really couldn't leave our house much anymore, and there was fighting finally because we were being liberated and so forth, but he and I would do very old crossword puzzles, and, sitting around one little lamp and with no heat and nothing. But you must also remember that had we known the first 6 months of the war that we were going to be occupied for 5 years, we might all have shot ourselves. We thought it would be over next week. We get good news with underground radio. It'll be over in 6 months or next year. And that's how we got through those 5 years. And they indeed did get worse and worse and worse. And finally, in the last year, civilians were totally just tolerated but ignored. There were no provisions made. There was no food in the shops. And that last winter, I mean, nothing grows in the winter. You can keep carrots and potatoes for just so long and some turnips, but we were running out of those. And that was really very, very hard.
Did you have to excise this in adulthood? I assume, I mean, did you have therapy? Did you find yourself going through boxes of Kleenex with somebody on these memories? No.
No, not at all. Because the very fact that the day we were liberated was so exciting, and that's when life started again. That is what was so exciting about the aftermath of the war. All the things you'd never had, never seen, never eaten, never worn, started to come back again. That was such a stimulus. And then as soon as I could, I wanted desperately to become a dancer, and I got a scholarship in the Rambert Ballet School in London. Everything was new, everything was exciting, and that has stayed with me till today. It's given me such an appreciation of what we have, and also the greatest luxury of all, and that's freedom, liberty. To be free to say what you want, do what you want, without, you know,